The glass door of the restaurant exploded open as a black SUV screeched to a stop on the curb, two tires jumping onto the sidewalk. Four men in dark suits moved fast, forming a wall around a fifth man who stepped out last, one hand pressed to his ribs, blood seeping between his fingers. Customers screamed and dropped their trays. A woman grabbed her toddler and ducked under a table. The Mafia boss, Kang Do-yun, staggered through the doorway of the restaurant he had visited only once before, and the first face he saw was an 8-year-old girl standing frozen by the host's stand, holding a stack of napkins. Before anyone tells you how it happened, before you understand why a Korean crime boss bled out on the floor of a small American bakery cafe, you need to know what happened 3 weeks earlier. Because this story didn't start with blood. It started with a ring. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will stay with you long after this video ends. 3 weeks before that morning, the restaurant was calm, warm, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the low hum of a Saturday lunch rush. Yolanda Briggs had worked there for 11 years. She was 61, silver threading through her braids, and everyone from the dishwashers to the general manager called her Miss Yo, with a kind of respect usually reserved for people twice her rank. She didn't just work at the restaurant. She was the restaurant, in the way that some employees become the soul of a place without ever asking for the title. That Saturday, school was out, and she'd asked her manager, Frank Delaney, if she could bring her granddaughter in for the day. "You know Nova's no trouble, Frank," she said, wiping down the pastry case. "She just wants to help fold napkins and greet folks at the door, keeps her busy while I finish my shift." Frank didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Miss Yo, when has that child ever been trouble? Bring her in. Regulars ask about her when she's not here." Nova Briggs was 8 years old, small for her age, with 2 neat puffs in her hair and a gap in her front teeth she was very proud of. She had grown up in the back hallways of that restaurant, doing her homework at the corner booth, learning to say "welcome in" to every customer like she meant it because she did. The security guard at the door, a heavy-set man named Curtis, always gave her a fist bump when she walked in. The baristas let her stack the little paper cups into towers. She belonged there the way a favorite plant belongs by a window, quiet, familiar, something the whole room would notice if it were gone. That same Saturday, Kang Do-yun walked into the restaurant for the first time in his life. He was not what people expected when they pictured a man who controlled half the shipping routes moving in and out of 3 ports. He wore a plain charcoal suit, no watch, no rings except one, a platinum band, thin, unassuming to anyone who didn't know its weight. He sat alone at a corner table, ordered black coffee and a simple lunch, and said almost nothing to the server except "thank you" in careful, accented English. Do-yun's men waited outside in 2 cars. He'd insisted on going in alone. It was the only hour of peace he allowed himself most weeks, an hour where no one called him sir, where no one needed a decision made, where he could simply eat a meal like a man instead of an empire. Halfway through his coffee, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, exhaled slowly, and stood. He walked to the restroom, following a habit that had outlived his father by 6 years. His father had always removed his ring before washing his hands, said metal against wet hands felt wrong, said a man should feel his own skin when he cleaned it. Do-yun had adopted the habit as a boy, mimicking him, and after his father died, the habit became a kind of prayer. He slid the ring off, set it gently on the edge of the porcelain sink, and washed his hands. The phone in his pocket buzzed again, then a third time. "Sir, we have a problem at the West Terminal," a voice said the second he answered. "Now, sir, it can't wait." Do-yun's jaw tightened. He dried his hands on a paper towel, already moving toward the door, his mind 3 steps ahead, calculating exposure, calculating who had talked, calculating how fast he needed to be at the docks before the situation became a war instead of a disagreement. He walked straight past the sink. The ring stayed exactly where he'd left it, gleaming faintly under the bathroom light, alone. 10 minutes later, Nova skipped into the restroom to wash her hands before helping restock the napkin station, the way her grandmother had taught her to do before touching anything customers would use. She turned on the tap, reached for the soap, and stopped. There beside the sink sat a ring. Platinum, smooth, simple, catching the light in a way that made her lean closer. She didn't touch it right away. She looked around, as if the owner might still be standing there, embarrassed, waiting to grab it. No one was. She picked it up carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to hold anything that wasn't hers like it was made of glass, and walked straight out of the restroom, weaving through the lunch crowd until she found her grandmother restocking the coffee station. "Grandma, somebody forgot this," Nova said, holding the ring up in her open palm. Yolanda glanced down, expecting a hair tie or a child's toy. Instead, she saw the dull platinum shine and immediately understood two things: that it wasn't cheap and that it wasn't theirs. "Let's make sure it gets back to the person who lost it," she said simply, and took Nova's hand. They walked together to Frank's office. Yolanda knocked twice before letting herself in. "Frank, my granddaughter found this near the restroom," she said, setting the ring on his desk. "Wanted to make sure it goes in lost and found the right way, not just sitting around." Frank picked it up, turned it once in the light, whistled low. "This is real platinum, Miss Yo. Somebody's missing this pretty bad right about now. That's exactly why we're standing here instead of walking out that door with it," Yolanda said, a little sharper than she meant to, though Frank only laughed and nodded because he already knew that about her. Nova tugged her grandmother's sleeve. "Is the person gonna be sad?" "Probably real sad, baby." "Then I hope they find out fast." Frank wrote a note, dropped the ring into a small labeled envelope, and locked it in the drawer reserved for lost and found items worth more than a phone charger. Nova went back to folding napkins like nothing had happened at all, because to her, nothing had. She'd found something. She'd given it to the person who could get it back to its owner. That was the whole story as far as she was concerned. If this story is already pulling at something in you, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. Now let's find out what happened when Do-Yun realized what he'd lost. He didn't notice until almost midnight. The West Terminal crisis had eaten his entire afternoon. 3 hours of tense negotiation with a supplier who tried to quietly double-cross him, followed by 2 more hours making sure the man understood, without violence, that it would never happen again. By the time Do-Yun collapsed into the leather seat of his SUV, his shoulders ached, and his mind was already moving toward the next fire he'd have to put out in the morning. It was his driver, Min-ho, who noticed first. "Sir, your ring," Min-ho said quietly, glancing at Do-Yun's hand resting on his knee. Do-Yun looked down. His stomach dropped in a way that no business deal, no threat, no gun pointed in his direction had ever managed to make it drop. "Stop the car," he said. "Sir." "Stop the car, Min-ho." They pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, engine idling, hazard lights blinking against the dark. Do-Yun sat completely still for a long moment, running through his entire day, every place he'd been, every surface he'd touched, every sink he'd washed his hands in. "The restaurant." "Turn around," he said, "now." "Sir, it's nearly midnight. They'll be closed." "I don't care if they're closed. Turn the car around." Min-ho didn't argue again. He'd worked for Do-Yun for 9 years and had learned there were exactly 3 things that could make his composed, controlled boss raise his voice: his mother's health, a threat to his men, and that ring. He'd never once seen his boss without it, not in 9 years, not even in the shower according to the housekeeper who'd once found it sitting on the bathroom counter and nearly gotten fired for moving it an inch. They arrived to a dark parking lot and a locked front door, a single security light glowing over the entrance. Do-Yun stood at the glass for a long moment, staring at his own reflection, at his bare hand, feeling something close to panic for the first time in years. "We'll come back in the morning," Minho said gently, "the moment they open." Du-yun didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the lights off, turning his bare hand over and over, remembering his father's voice, remembering the exact weight of the ring against his palm the day it had been placed there after the funeral. He remembered his father telling him, when he was still young enough to think his father would live forever, "This ring isn't about wealth, Du-yun. Wealth I can hand you. This is about knowing where you came from when everyone forgets to ask." At 6 the next morning, he was parked outside the restaurant an hour before it opened. When Frank finally unlocked the doors at 7, he found a well-dressed Korean man standing perfectly still on the sidewalk, hands folded in front of him, looking like he hadn't slept. "I apologize for the early hour," Du-yun said. "I believe I may have left something here yesterday. A ring, platinum. I was at the corner table." Frank's eyebrows lifted. "You wouldn't happen to remember exactly where you might have left it, would you?" "The restroom beside the sink." Frank exhaled, relief washing over his face, because he genuinely worried the owner would never come back, that the ring would sit in that drawer for months while some stranger's story stayed unfinished. "Come on in. I think we might have exactly what you're looking for." He led Du-yun back to his office, unlocked the drawer and pulled out the small envelope. Du-yun's hands weren't steady as Frank handed it to him. He opened it, and there it was, his father's ring, safe, untouched, exactly as he'd left it. He slid it back onto his finger and closed his eyes for one full second. The tension, leaving his shoulders like a held breath, finally released. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea what this means to me." "Don't thank me," Frank said, waving a hand. "Wasn't me who found it and brought it straight to my office instead of pocketing it. Your ring was found by our employee's 8-year-old granddaughter. Little girl named Nova. Didn't even blink twice about it, just handed it over and asked if the owner would be sad." Something shifted in Du-yun's expression, subtle, but Frank noticed it. The way a man's whole posture can change around a single sentence. 8 years old, Du-yun repeated softly. 8 years old, and more honest than half the grown men I've met. Her name again. Nova Briggs. Her grandmother's one of our best, Yolanda Miss Yo, we call her. Been with us 11 years. Du-yun said nothing for a moment, simply looking down at the ring on his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then he nodded once, thanked Frank again, and walked out into the morning light. He didn't say another word in the car for 20 minutes. Minho watched him in the rearview mirror, saw him turn the ring slowly around his finger, over and over. "Sir, everything all right?" "An 8-year-old girl found it," Du-yun said finally. "She didn't take it, she didn't even think to keep it, she just gave it away, to someone she'd never met." "Some people are raised that way," Minho offered. "Most people aren't," Du-yun said, and turned to look out the window, watching the city blur past, his mind somewhere far away from ports and shipments and debts owed. Most people would have kept it and told themselves they deserved it. For the rest of that week, Du-yun could not stop thinking about her. It bothered him in a way he didn't fully understand, a grown man, controlling more money and more danger than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, undone by the plain honesty of a child he'd never met. He found himself replaying the sentence Frank had said, again and again. She just handed it over and asked if the owner would be sad. He'd spent his whole adult life around people who wanted something from him. Loyalty bought with fear. Respect bought with money. Every relationship in his world came with an invisible price tag, a favor owed, a debt collected eventually. And here was an 8-year-old girl who had held something worth more than she probably understood and asked for nothing at all. By the second week, he had made a decision. "I want to do something for her," he told Minho over dinner, the first time he'd raised the subject aloud. "Not a reward, not a transaction, something real." "What did you have in mind, sir?" "An education fund. A trust set up properly so it's there when she needs it, college, whatever she wants to become. and I want to write her a letter myself, not something drafted by a lawyer, something from me." Minho studied him for a long moment. In 9 years, he had never once seen Du-yun propose something with absolutely nothing to gain from it. "That's a generous gesture, sir." "It's not a gesture," Du-yun said, more sharply than he intended, then softened. "It's the least I can do. She had every reason to keep it. No one would have known, and she gave it back without asking for a single thing." By the third week, everything was ready. The trust had been drawn up quietly through a private attorney Du-yun trusted completely. No press, no publicity, no strings attached that could ever be pulled later. He wrote the letter himself, 3 drafts, crumpling the first 2, because he found it strange how much harder it was to write 10 honest sentences to a child than to negotiate a multi-million-dollar shipping contract. He wrapped a small gift box himself, something he hadn't done since he was young, since before his father died and he'd inherited a world that left no time for wrapping paper. Inside was a smaller ring, a child's size, simple and platinum, a quiet echo of his own, engraved on the inside band with 3 words, "For your honesty." He asked Frank for the address, promising it would remain between them. Frank hesitated only a moment before giving it, trusting the look in Du-yun's eyes, the same look he'd seen the morning the man had stood outside his restaurant before it opened, desperate for something that couldn't be bought back with money. "If you've made it this far, you already know this story is building towards something big, so don't scroll away now. Smash that like button if you're rooting for Nova and stick around, because what Du-yun is about to walk into is not what he expected at all." The black SUV pulled up outside a modest 1-story house on a quiet street, the kind with chain-link fences and small front porches, and a basketball hoop bolted crookedly over a garage door 2 houses down. Frank had led Du-yun there personally, insisting on walking him to the gate himself before quietly excusing himself back to the car, respecting that whatever happened next needed to happen without an audience. Du-yun stood at the gate for a long moment, holding the wrapped gift box in one hand and a leather folder in the other, containing the paperwork for the trust. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not during negotiations with armed men, not during the tensest business deals of his career. He walked up the short path and knocked on the door. It opened slower than he expected. An elderly black woman stood in the doorway, not Yolanda. He realized immediately, someone older, her eyes red-rimmed. A black cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the warm afternoon. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the stillness of the house behind her, in the low murmur of voices further inside, in the way she looked at him like a stranger arriving at the worst possible moment. He lowered his head respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry for your loss," he said quietly, though he had no idea yet what loss he was apologizing for. He only knew instinctively that something had happened. The woman's face crumpled. Her hand went to the doorframe to steady herself. He paused, then added softly, "Your granddaughter once did something for me, and I came to thank her." The woman's eyes filled instantly with tears. She said nothing at all, simply stepped aside, silently inviting him in, as if his words had answered some question she hadn't known how to ask. Cut to black. 2 weeks earlier. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that gave no warning of what was coming. Nova walked to school the way she always did, her backpack a size too big, her grandmother watching from the porch until she turned the corner, same as every morning for the past 3 years. Yolanda went to her shift at the restaurant. Frank greeted her the way he always did. Nothing about that Tuesday suggested it would become the hinge on which everything else turned. It happened just after noon. A car driven by a man running a red light, phone in hand, distracted for 4 seconds that would rewrite a family's entire life, struck a group of children crossing at the corner 3 blocks from Nova's school. Nova was the only one seriously hurt. She'd pushed a younger boy she barely knew out of the car's path a half-second before impact, an instinct so fast, so instant, that witnesses later said they didn't even see her think about it. She simply moved. The boy walked away with a scraped knee. Nova did not walk away at all. Yolanda got the call at the restaurant. Frank drove her to the hospital himself, running 2 red lights of his own, praying the entire way that hurrying wouldn't matter, that it would be nothing, that Nova would look up at her grandmother with that gap-toothed grin and tell her not to worry. She held on for 6 days. The hospital staff said it was one of the worst injuries they'd seen from an accident at that speed. Trauma the doctors fought against with everything modern medicine could offer. Yolanda sat by her bed every single hour she wasn't required to be somewhere else, holding Nova's small hand, talking to her the way you talk to someone you refuse to believe can't hear you. "You did the right thing, baby," she whispered over and over. "You always do the right thing, that's who you are." On the 6th day, Nova passed away, surrounded by her grandmother's voice, in a hospital room 3 blocks from the intersection where she'd saved a stranger's child without a second's hesitation. The same instinct, the same nature, that had once made her hand a platinum ring to her grandmother instead of slipping it into her pocket. The funeral was 3 days before Duyun knocked on that door. He had no way of knowing. In the 2 weeks he'd spent preparing the trust fund and writing his letter, and wrapping a small platinum ring meant to say thank you, that the little girl he was preparing to honor had already been laid to rest, that the restaurant staff had closed early the day of the funeral so every single person who'd known her could attend, that Curtis, the security guard, had cried at his post the whole first day back, that Frank had kept her favorite booth empty for a week because no one had the heart to seat anyone else there. Inside the small house, Duyun sat across from Yolanda in a living room crowded with folding chairs and half-eaten casseroles brought by neighbors, family members speaking in hushed voices in the kitchen, a framed photo of Nova on the mantel, gap-toothed smile, 2 neat puffs, eyes bright with the kind of joy that made the whole room feel warmer just looking at it. "I didn't know," Duyun said quietly, his voice unsteady in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. "I came because your granddaughter found something I lost, something that meant everything to me. She could have kept it. She gave it back without asking for anything. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wanted to do something for her future." Yolanda pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears sliding freely now. "She never told me she found nothing worth all this. She whispered, she just said somebody forgot a ring. She saved a little boy's life 2 weeks ago," Duyun said gently, having learned the story from Frank on the drive over, Frank's voice breaking as he explained it. "The same way she gave my ring back, without thinking twice. That's simply who she was." "That's who she was," Yolanda echoed, nodding slowly, holding the words like something fragile. Duyun set the leather folder on the coffee table between them, though it suddenly felt smaller than it had that morning, less important than he'd imagined it would be. "I set up an education trust in her name," he said quietly. "I know she won't. I know it can't reach her now, but I'd like it to go towards something that honors her instead. A scholarship. Something with her name on it for children like her, the ones who do the right thing when no one's watching and never ask for a thing in return." Yolanda was quiet for a long moment, looking at the folder, then at the framed photo on the mantel, then finally at the stranger sitting in her living room who had somehow found his way to her door on the worst week of her life, carrying nothing but gratitude for a child he'd never even properly met. "She would have liked that," Yolanda finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "She always did like the idea of helping people she'd never meet." Duyun reached into his jacket and withdrew the small wrapped box, setting it gently beside the folder. "This was meant to be a thank you," he said. "I'd still like you to have it, if that's all right." Yolanda unwrapped it slowly, careful hands, the way Nova had always been taught to handle things that weren't hers. Inside sat the small platinum ring, the engraving catching the light for your honesty. She held it for a long time without speaking, tracing the engraved letters with her thumb, And then she began to cry in earnest, the kind of crying that had been building for 6 days and finally found somewhere safe to land. "Thank you," she managed, "for coming all this way, for remembering her." "I'll never forget her," Du-yun said quietly, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. He stayed another hour, listening as Yolanda spoke about her granddaughter, the napkin towers, the way she greeted every customer like they mattered, the fist bumps with Curtis at the door, the way she used to fall asleep in the corner booth with her homework half finished, one puff of hair pressed flat against the table. He listened the way he wished someone had listened to him after his own father died, without rushing the grief, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Before he left, he made one more promise. Quiet, firm, the same tone he used when sealing deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Except this time there was nothing calculated in it at all. "The scholarship will carry her name for as long as I'm alive to make sure of it," he said. "Every child who receives it will know her story. That honesty like hers is rare and worth honoring." Yolanda walked him to the door, the small ring now on a chain around her neck, resting where she could feel it against her chest. "She'd be so surprised," Yolanda said softly, a small broken laugh escaping despite the tears. "She never thought what she did was anything special, just thought it was what you're supposed to do." "That's exactly what made it special," Du-yun said. He walked back to the SUV alone, Minho waiting behind the wheel, watching his boss's face in the rearview mirror. The same composed, unreadable man who had once negotiated with armed smugglers without flinching, now wiping his eyes before he'd even reached the car door. They didn't speak for the entire drive back. There was nothing that needed saying. 3 weeks later, in a quiet ceremony attended by the restaurant staff, Yolanda, and a handful of local reporters who'd caught wind of the story despite Du-yun's efforts to keep it private, the Nova Briggs Honesty Scholarship was formally announced, funded in full, awarded annually to a local child recognized not for grades or achievements, but for character, for doing the right thing when no one was watching. Frank kept a small photo of Nova behind the host stand from that day forward, right where she used to stand handing out menus with a smile too big for her face. Curtis still glanced at the door some mornings, half expecting a small hand to reach up for a fist bump. And every year, on the anniversary of the scholarship, Du-yun returned to that restaurant, sat at the same corner table, ordered the same black coffee, and remembered a little girl who had taught a man who owned nearly everything that the only things worth keeping were the ones you were willing to give away. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved everyone who lived it, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like Nova's are exactly why this channel exists. Real honesty, real consequences, real redemption, told the way they deserve to be told. Drop a like if you believe kindness like hers still exists in this world, and leave a comment telling us which part hit you hardest. We read every single one, and we'll see you in the next story.